Hello, I'm Arik Korman, Communications Director at League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime Webinars. We started this series 6 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today's webinar is about what to expect in the 2020 Washington State Legislative Session. In the 2020 legislative session, League of Education Voters will prioritize policies to help lay the foundation of an equitable education system that provides what students need, when and where they need it. Our speakers today are League of Education Voters Director of Policy and Research, Julia Worth, and lobbyist Carrie Morris. They will give an overview of the 2020 landscape, outline the possibilities in 2020 around sufficient and effective resources for every student receiving special education services, supportive and safe learning environments for every student in K-12 schools, equitable levy and local effort assistance structures targeted to student needs, and high-quality early childhood education for every learner. They will also answer your questions. Julia Worth joined League of Education Voters in 2015. Prior to joining LEV, she worked as a senior research analyst for the Washington State Board of Education, helped launch the Washington State Charter Schools Association, and worked in public policy consulting. Julia is committed to helping create a school system in which every student has access to an education that prepares and empowers. Julia received her bachelor's in literature and government from Claremont McKenna College in Southern California and returned home to Seattle for her Master of Education degree from the University of Washington. When she's not in the office, Julia enjoys playing in the mountains and spending time with her family. Carrie Morris began lobbying state and local government entities in 1999. Prior to this, Carrie was the legislative assistant to State Senator Georgia Gardner, worked on numerous political campaigns, and served as an advisor coordinator for the Voter Power Project in Northwest Washington, a Get Out the Vote campaign for women involved in the domestic violence community. Carrie has worked with clients ranging from local government entities to grassroots advocacy groups. She provides these clients with services that include issue research, coalition building, monitoring and tracking legislation, and strategically working and supporting their interests within the political process. Carrie maintains strong, effectual relationships with clients and public officials by providing accurate research and a commitment to creating strong public policy. There's a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to submit questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function at the bottom of your screen, or you can email info@educationvoters.org. Welcome, Julia and Carrie.
Thank you so much, Arik. So this is Julia Worth, and as Arik mentioned, we're going to give information about the League of Education Voters priorities for the 2020 legislative session, and then also a little preview around the legislative landscape and what's going on down in Olympia. So thank you everybody for joining us, and happy snowy beginning of session. I'll start by going through the legislative priorities and then turn things over to Carrie. So as Arik mentioned, we are working in 5 main priority areas this session, so focused on special education resources, supportive and safe learning environments, equitable access to levy and local local effort assistance funds, high quality early childhood education, and then also closing gaps in grades K through 3. All right. So to begin with, in the area of special education resources, we are focused in the 2020 session on lifting the 13.5% cap on funded enrollment of students receiving special education services. So currently in Washington State, districts receive additional funding for students that require special education services, but the state only provides funding up to 13.5% of a district's enrollment. So if a district enrolls, say, 15% of their student body that requires special education services, they only receive funding from the state for 13.5% of their students, and then have to come up with the resources to provide services to the remaining students that are above that 13.5% cap from somewhere else in the district budget. Excuse me. This is particularly impacts small local education agencies, and around 60% of the local education agencies that are over the 13.5% cap have fewer than 2,000 students. So it's an equity concern across the state for small and rural local education agencies. So we'll be working with partners this session on lifting that 13.5% cap. I will note that League of Education Voters is also part of the Investing in Student Potential Coalition, which is focused on special education funding, but also reforming the special education system and how we serve students in schools. And so there is a broader agenda to better serve students receiving special education services that we are part of with that coalition.
Hey, Julia, what exactly is a local education agency?
So a local education agency is a government entity that provides educational services. So the most common form in Washington state is the school district. And then charter schools, charter public schools in Washington state are also their own local education agencies.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Next on our agenda is supportive and safe learning environments. So we have two priorities in this area this session. The first being to ensure that students have reliable and consistent access to mental health services in their school building. And we are advocating for every student to have access to mental health services through either staff within the building or also contracting out with community partners or other public agencies in the community that might be able to provide those services. We are also advocating for state assistance to encourage and enable districts to implement multi-tiered systems of support. So these are the frameworks that schools and districts can use to identify student need and then identify appropriate resources and supports. And this is both academic and non-academic. So really looking at the child as a whole person, and then bringing all of the different resources to bear within the school and the community to support each individual student and make sure that they're getting the resources they need when and where they need them. Next on our agenda is equitable access to levy and local effort assistance funds. So over the past few years, the state has made a number of changes to the local levy system and the amounts of funding that local districts can raise through the local levy system. There have also been changes to the local effort assistance funds, and these are the funds that the state provides to districts that do not have as high of levy capacity as some of the wealthier districts in the state. Currently, this local effort assistance structure still creates inequities between districts that have low property values and higher community need, and districts that have high property values and potentially less community need. And so we are advocating for the local effort assistance program to not take into consideration only property values of a district, but also other community and student need factors to make sure that we are really driving resources to the communities with the highest need in the state. Moving on to high quality early childhood education, we will be advocating this session for an increase in access to high quality, affordable, culturally and linguistically responsive early learning, and this includes childcare and preschool. We are part of the Early Learning Action Alliance, and we'll be advocating with our partners to ensure that every student has access to these services through expansion of ECAP, and making sure that the reimbursement rates for childcare programs and for ECAP allow providers to provide the high quality of services that we're hoping for, and also compensate providers in a way that is sustainable for their businesses. And finally, on our agenda is gap closing in grades K through 3. So this school year is the first school year that districts are at risk of losing additional state funding that has historically been allocated for the reduction of K-3 class sizes. So the state has been providing additional money to districts to reduce class sizes in grades K through 3 without the requirement that districts actually have those average class sizes. So districts have had some flexibility in how they use those funds. This year, districts who do not have the required maximum class sizes in grades K through 3 will lose access to that funding. So we are proposing that, excuse me, districts who have been unable to reduce class sizes, and often this is because of capital constraints, so just not having enough classroom space in the building, or workforce considerations, so not having enough certificated staff in the community to be hired to reduce these class sizes. We are advocating that those districts be able to keep the money or keep the funds that would have been used for class size reduction and to invest that money into K through 3 gap closing efforts that are in alignment with the Washington Integrated Student Supports Protocol. So still using those funds to achieve the goals of class size reduction and making sure that all students are on standard by the time they reach 3rd grade, but employing different strategies when districts are unable to actually reduce their class sizes. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie Morris to give us the legislative landscape.
Thank you, Julia and Eric. Yes, this is Carrie Morris, and I'm sitting watching the snow fall in Olympia. So even despite Mother Nature, the session started yesterday, Monday the 13th. We're in day 2, and currently our Governor Inslee is doing his State of the State address. And so you can watch on the archives of TVW. If you're not familiar with TVW, you should start getting familiar, because you too can watch the thrilling hearings and committees and floor actions that happen down Olympia in your own comfort of your own home. So what I'm saying is right now, the first 2 days of session usually are full of a lot of joint sessions, a lot of pomp and circumstance, all the kind of celebrating that we're back down here, but it's a 60-day session, which means it's a supplemental session. So we hit the ground running. So even though there are State of the States happening, there are still staff meetings. Yesterday was historic. We started there was a House session where the new Speaker Lori Jenkins from the 27th down Pierce County, was sworn in. She is the first female speaker, first woman, and also the first out member of the LGBTQ caucus to hold that gavel. So that was a historic day. And even while that was happening, there was still committee work going on. So we are trying to get every minute of every day out of the 60 days down here, because it passes quickly. And several times yesterday, you heard the new speaker say it in appropriations where they were presenting on the governor's budget. They discussed it. They are seeing this truly as a supplemental year, which means last year when we were down here for 105 days, they passed the operating budget, and they made the investments they felt that would get us for a 2-year biennial budget for our agencies and the things they're committed to funding. This year we come down, and it's just to see what problems arise, what needed to be cleaned up, what needed a little bit of fixing or a little bit more funding. So that's what a supplemental year is for. And it was said several times, this will be a true supplemental year. That being said, they are making big investments, or want to make big investments in the homelessness crisis, including looking at how we can help and support our homeless families and homeless students. They also want to look at childcare and early learning and how they can make some investments there. One of the things that I feel is important is to remind them that, yes, they made historic investments and historic movement forward on the McCleary and K-12 funding, but their job isn't done. There is still a huge $300 million gap in special ed funding that we need to deal with. They're still looking at the social emotional learning aspect of education and how we can keep our schools and our families whole until our next operating year. So I can't emphasize enough, it's 60 days. That means there's only about 3 weeks of hearings in their house of origin, and it's going to move quickly. So I encourage everybody who has been working on issues to follow them online on TVW, and really these first 3 weeks are going to be busy, but reach out to legislators and communicate with them on things that you support, because they need as much information and help as possible. Is there anything else you need me to cover, Julia? Sorry, I never know
Nope.
what I'm supposed to be covering on these. I have a lot of opinions that I keep to myself, but I just that's where we're at. I was hoping the snow would slow things down, but it hasn't.
That was great, and I'm sure we'll have some questions for you in the Q&A section.
Right.
So now we'd like to open it up to all of you, and feel free to type your questions into the chat function. And Arik, I will turn it back over to you.
All right, great. And actually the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen is the place to type your questions. And we've got about 10 minutes, so plenty of time. I'm going to start with the question that came in about special education funding. The question is about how much would it cost to lift the cap on special education funding?
That is a great question. So we just got information from OSPI, and let me pull it up and make sure that I am giving the accurate number. Ooh, where did it go? So the OSPI estimate that we have received is around 38 million. It is important to remember that there will also be a move next year to a different structure for the multiplier. Previously, it was a flat rate for all students in the special education system. Now, starting next year, I believe, is when it will move to a two-tiered multiplier. And so districts will receive different rates of funding from the state based on the amount of time that a student spends in an inclusive or what's called the least restrictive environment setting. And so that will impact some of the numbers as well.
Great. So when you say least restrictive environment setting, that's when a student receiving special education services is in the general education classroom?
General education classroom, or what is deemed the most appropriate inclusive setting for that student.
Great. And how would you describe a multiplier for people who don't know?
Yes, so a multiplier is just a function of the funding formula. So it is, the state looks at the amount that districts will get per pupil for a general education student, and then currently the multiplier is they would multiply that by 0.96, so you get almost double in funding again for a special education student, and then that multiplier will change, as I said, next year, and so there will be one at a lower rate and one at a higher rate, but same functionality. Great,
thank you. All right, this next question is probably more for Carrie, and it is, what is the impact of Tim Iman's $30 car tab initiative on the state budget?
It is significant. Right now, because the courts are involved, they're moving forward with, mostly that's on the transportation side, but they're moving forward with making sure there will be no crossover from operating to help the transportation. Transportation will move forward if it didn't pass while it's being debated, but they're being very cautious. They're being very clear that they want to do by the will of the people, but also not do drastic harm to our budgeting process. So as of now, the governor's budget recognized it, but it did not affect the operating. I mean, at some point, we can't supplement what's happening to the extreme that would hurt the programs within the operating. But it's significant. We know it's out there. Everybody's talking about it. But I want to say also, on the supplemental year, we have our rainy day fund, which for the first time in quite a while is a significant amount. I think it's about $2 billion. But once we do the maintenance of effort funding in our budget process for supplemental, which is keeping the programs whole that the legislature took action on, or programs that have historically been funded by the legislature, we only have about $300 million this session to put into new programs or to increase funding in existing programs. So it's not a significant amount that they will be dealing with. The governor's budget did go into the rainy day fund to pull out to help on the homelessness issue. It is unknown, or I don't know if the legislature will follow that, but right now we're just looking at a pretty small amount to keep us going until the next budget year.
Great, thank you. Another question for you, Carrie, which is, what changes do you expect to see in Olympia with the new speaker?
I think it's exciting. Jenkins, who, you know, has she has a public health background, healthcare background. She is more progressive than her predecessor, Frank Chop. She has stated that she will really follow what the members of her caucus want. So she won't be pushing any of her own agenda items. What we'll see is how she works with her committee chairs. In the last 20-some years, Frank Chop really had hands-on. He wanted to look at agendas of committees and okay agendas and which bills were coming to the floor. Speaker Jenkins has been clear that she is going to take the lead from her chair. She has trust in her chairs to work their agendas and really listen to what her caucus wants to bring to the floor. She is committed to the 60 days, getting us on time, and really looking at moving forward on keeping the majority in a really big campaign and election year in 2020. So I think you'll see a little bit more communication, a little bit more transparency than we've had before.
Great, thank you.
I think it's exciting. It's all exciting. Change is good.
Yeah, it sounds great. So this is a question, Julia, that you could probably answer, which is, how does a multi-tiered system of support work? Going back to one of our supportive and safe schools priorities. And are there any districts that are doing the multi-tiered system of support, or MTSS? Are they doing it well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a multi-tiered system of support, and OSPI on their website has some great resources on this. Also, the UW Smart Center has a lot of great resources on this. And if folks are familiar with the model of response to intervention, it's very similar to that. So there's, if folks have seen kind of the triangle, that's red, green, and yellow, and the bottom is, so the bottom tier, or tier 1, are supports and interventions that basically every student in the school gets. So something like implementing social emotional learning curriculum. That is the support that every student will need in the school setting. Then tier 2 is more targeted supports. And so students would assessed for need, either academically or non-academically, other types of supports they might need, either in the social emotional realm, or mental health, or some of those other supports as we've discussed, and that would be tier 2, so a little bit more targeted. Sometimes in the academic model, you'll see small group instruction or differentiated instruction there. And then tier 3 is the really more intensive supports. And so again, based on a needs assessment, would be more targeted or individualized supports for students. And I'm speaking in kind of generalities because the tiers and the types of things that students might need in each of those tiers are going to look different in every school building. You know, special education services aren't always a tier 3 intervention. It's not always the most extreme, right? And I don't mean to use extreme in a negative way, just that they would be might not be the most intensive, I should say. So each school will kind of define their triangle and their services and their tiers based off of the needs of the students in that building. A number of districts are beginning to implement MTSS. I think it's probably more, you would probably see it more at a school level versus kind of district-wide implementation. I'll have to get back to you on schools or districts that are doing it really well. I think there's a lot of districts that are starting out and learning as they go and are really making some great progress. I also want to note that the Integrated Student Supports Protocol, which OSPI has also developed in response to legislation 1541, a number 3 or 4 years ago, that is also a part of this structure of MTSS. So I've heard it talked about that, like the Integrated Student Supports Protocol is the what, and multi-tiered systems of support is the how. But basically the philosophy behind both is that you are assessing a student need or a student's need and a family's need in the school, and then bringing all of the community resources in the school building, but also within the community to bear to support students and families and make sure everyone's getting what they need.
Great, thank you very much. We have time for just about 1 or 2 more questions. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screen is the place to submit that. So here's a question, and Carrie, this is probably more directed toward you. How do legislators feel about education funding this session? How likely do you think they are to look at the local effort assistance program?
I think that there are several legislators who want to continue to make investments into our K-12. There's also others who feel that they need to make investments in the early learning to do the whole continuum of education from birth through college. I think they need to hear from people that these are issues that the public continues to care about and they need to take some action on. They do know that there are some areas that they need to make further investments in, and that they will be hearing from people come November as we go up to November. One of them being the special ed, one of them being some of the LEA stuff. But they have to be constantly reminded. They're being pulled in 60 days in so many different ways that I think we kind of can't stop the drumbeat to help our students on what in their local school districts and what they need. So I think there's a limited amount of money, but I would be surprised if some of it wasn't put into the K-12 system.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carrie. Yeah, that's great. That's great. So yeah, speaking of contacting our legislators, be on the lookout for action alerts, which will be coming your way this session. We'll be sending them out through our League of Education Voters email. You can subscribe to those. You can also subscribe to our weekly legislative roundup, which will be coming out every week or so. So that'll keep you up to date on what's happening in Olympia. And we also have our bill tracker. Our legislative bill tracker is available under resources at our website, educationvoters.org. Carrie and Julia, thanks so much for that. I really appreciate everything that you presented today. Our next webinar is not yet scheduled, but it will be based on what's happening in the legislative process. So do stay tuned for that. It will be coming up next month, and we'll be sending out information and posting it on our website, on our Facebook page, and sharing on our Twitter account. So thank you for each of you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to arik@educationvoters.org. That's spelled A-R-I-K. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org. Feel free to send it along to your friends and colleagues. If you'd like to learn more about League of Education Voters or support our work, please visit our website, educationvoters.org. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you will join us at future webinars. Julia, Carrie, thanks again for everything.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.